Tonight, we're stepping behind the stone walls of medieval convents, where things weren't quite as holy as the church wanted you to believe. Because what I'm about to tell you will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval nuns and expose one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing who's joining me from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of tea, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's 1401 in Venice, and behind the sacred walls of St. Angelo Convent, something is happening that would make even the most liberal modern person blush. Court records from this period tell tales of what officials delicately called dissolute deeds performed not just in convent cells, but at picnic outings where nuns would meet their lovers under the open sky. We're talking about illegitimate births, jealous rages between nuns fighting over the same man, and fugitive lovers scaling convent walls in the dead of night. But here's the kicker. This wasn't some isolated incident or a few rogue nuns gone wild. Between 1401 and 1487, Sant'Angelo Convent faced 52 separate prosecutions for sex crimes. 52. And this involved not just ordinary nuns, but two different abbesses who were sharing their favors with both aristocrats and common people alike. The corruption went all the way to the top. And before you think this was just a Venetian problem, let me tell you something that's going to blow your mind. Research examining monastic sexual misconduct in medieval England found that nearly half of all monasteries experienced cases of sexual misconduct over a 100-year period. Nearly half. We're not talking about rare exceptions here. We're talking about a systematic pattern that stretched across all of medieval Europe. The church knew about this, they documented it, they covered it up, and tonight I'm going to show you exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes, using the church's own records that they never intended for you to see. You see, what makes this story so incredible isn't just the shocking behavior itself. It's how the medieval Catholic Church developed one of the most sophisticated cover-up systems in human history. To hide these scandals, they created an entire theological framework that made it a sin to expose sin. They called it the doctrine of scandal, and it became the blueprint for centuries of institutional cover-ups that continue to this day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand how this all happened, you need to understand something crucial about medieval convents that nobody talks about. Most of these women weren't nuns by choice. In medieval Europe, if you were born a woman into a noble family, your options were brutally limited. You could get married off to whoever your father chose, usually for political or economic reasons. Or if your family couldn't afford a decent dowry, or if you were a second or third daughter, you got shipped off to a convent whether you wanted to go or not. Some girls were as young as 7 years old when their families made this decision for them. Imagine being a teenager full of all the natural desires and curiosity that come with that age, and suddenly finding yourself locked behind stone walls, forced to take vows you never wanted to take, surrounded by dozens of other women in the exact same situation. The church might have expected these women to suppress their natural human desires, but human nature had other plans. And the evidence for what really happened is absolutely staggering. Take Joan of Leeds, for example. In 1318, this clever nun decided she'd had enough of convent life. But she couldn't just walk out the front door. So what did she do? She faked her own death. Joan simulated a serious illness, then created a dummy that looked like her dead body, and arranged for it to be buried in sacred ground while she escaped to live freely in the outside world. The Archbishop of York was so outraged when he discovered the deception that he wrote multiple letters about it. And those letters survived for over 700 years. But Joan's story gets even more interesting. When she was finally tracked down, she told church authorities that she had been forced into the convent as a child by her parents, that she had never consented to become a nun and had continuously protested against it. She said she never actually took her vows willingly. And here's the thing that should shock you. This wasn't unusual. Many of the women in medieval convents had similar stories. The church records from places like Lincoln and Norwich paint an incredibly detailed picture of what life was really like behind convent walls. Bishop after bishop encountered case after case of sexual misconduct during their careers. The documentation is so extensive that historians can actually track patterns and statistics across different regions and time periods. And what they found is mind-blowing. The bishops' registers, which were the official record books kept by church authorities, contain account after account of nuns breaking their vows of chastity. But here's what's really fascinating. These weren't secret affairs that nobody knew about. The entire convent community usually knew what was going on. Sometimes the other nuns would report the misconduct to church authorities. Sometimes they would participate in punishing the offenders themselves. And sometimes they would cover for each other. At Catesby Priory in 1442, Bishop Alnwick documented a situation that reads like a medieval soap opera. The prioress, Margaret Waver, and a nun named Isabel Benet were accusing each other of having sexual relationships with local knights. Other nuns were taking sides, spreading gossip, and making counter-accusations. One nun accused Benet of spending entire nights with friars in nearby Northampton, dancing and playing the lute with them until midnight. The whole community was in chaos, with different factions forming around different scandals and accusations. And this wasn't happening in some remote, poorly managed convent. This was a well-established priory with connections to noble families and significant economic resources. But perhaps the most shocking case of all involves what happened at Littlemore Priory between 1517 and 1518. The prioress herself was having an affair with a priest named Richard Hughes, and they had an illegitimate daughter together. But that's just the beginning. The prioress was embezzling funds from the convent, pawning religious ornaments to support her lavish lifestyle, and brutally punishing any nun who dared to oppose her by locking them in closed rooms without food or water for days. When church authorities finally investigated, they found evidence of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple sexual misconduct. This was organized crime happening inside a religious institution, with the head of the convent using her position to exploit both the resources of the church and the women under her authority. Now, you might be wondering how we know all these details if the church was supposedly covering everything up. And that's where the story gets really interesting, because the medieval church's approach to these scandals was far more complex and calculating than you might imagine. They didn't deny that sexual misconduct was happening. Instead, they developed an entire system for managing it quietly and efficiently. The goal wasn't to stop the behavior entirely, which they seemed to recognize was impossible. The goal was to prevent it from becoming public knowledge that might shake people's faith in the church as an institution. And they had a theological justification for this approach that was absolutely brilliant in its cynical logic. Christian theologians and church lawyers argued that making sexual misconduct public was itself a sin because it could cause scandal among the faithful. If ordinary people learned that their spiritual leaders were breaking their vows, it might lead them to lose faith and fall into sin themselves. Therefore, the argument went, anyone who exposed sexual misconduct was actually committing the sin of scandal, which was just as serious as the original sexual sin. This created a perfect catch-22. If you reported sexual misconduct, you were sinning by causing scandal. If you stayed silent, you were protecting the faith of others. The system was designed to ensure that virtually nothing would ever become public knowledge. But the church didn't just rely on theological arguments. They developed practical procedures for handling these situations that were remarkably sophisticated. When a nun became pregnant, which happened more often than you might think, there was an established protocol for managing the situation. The pregnant nun would be quietly confined during her pregnancy, but church authorities were careful not to harm the unborn child. After the birth, the baby would be discreetly passed to the nun's relatives or to the father's family. The nun herself would do penance, but she could then be reintegrated into the convent community. Some of these women even went on to become abbesses themselves. In 1259, a nun in Normandy gave birth with the help of 2 village midwives and sent the baby to be raised by her aunt. In 14th century Bergamo, a nun who had 3 children with a priest later became the abbess of her convent. The system was designed to minimize scandal while ensuring the survival of both mother and child. This wasn't happening in just a few isolated cases. The documentation suggests that this was a regular, predictable occurrence that the church had learned to manage as a routine administrative matter. And here's something that should really disturb you. Statistical analysis of the surviving records shows that church authorities were far more concerned with economic and leadership issues in convents than they were with sexual misconduct. Bishops would spend pages documenting financial irregularities or administrative problems, but sexual violations were often mentioned briefly and then quickly move was clear. Deed passed. The message, as long as the convents were financially Sexual misconduct was stable and well managed, treated as a minor disciplinary issue that could be handled quietly and efficiently. But sometimes the situations got so extreme that even this sophisticated cover-up system couldn't contain them. And when that happened, the results could be absolutely shocking. The case of the nun of Wotton, which occurred in the 1140s, involves violence so extreme that it reads like something from a horror movie. A young nun at Wotton Priory in Yorkshire became pregnant by a young friar. When the other nuns discovered what had happened, they didn't report it to church authorities. Instead, they took justice into their own hands. They seized the man and forced the pregnant nun to castrate him with her own hands. Then, in and shoved his severed testicles, act of unimaginable cruelty, they into her mouth while they were still bloody. The nun was then chained by her legs, locked in a cell, and fed nothing but bread and water. The account of this incident was recorded by Saint Elred of Rivol, who described the fury of the nuns and noted that the senior sisters had to physically prevent the others from burning, flaying, and branding the pregnant woman. This wasn't justice. This was mob violence happening inside a religious institution. And yet, even this extreme case was recorded not as a condemnation of the system, but as a moral lesson about the consequences of breaking religious vows. The more you dig into these records, the more you realize that what we're looking at isn't just isolated incidents of misconduct. We're looking at evidence of systematic institutional failure that the church not only knew about, but actively worked to conceal. And this system of concealment wasn't just limited to sexual misconduct. It became a template for how the church would handle any scandal that threatened its reputation or authority. The doctrine of scandal that they developed in medieval times created a framework that would be used for centuries to come. But let's get back to the evidence, because what happened next in places like St. Angelo Convent shows just how far this corruption could spread when left unchecked. Remember, St. Angelo had been dealing with prosecutions for sex crimes for nearly a century, 86 years of documented misconduct, and the church kept finding ways to manage it quietly. But by 1489, even their sophisticated cover-up system couldn't contain the scandal anymore. The Pope finally had to shut the entire convent down. But here's the really disturbing part. Other convents that were more careful about hiding their activities remained open. The church wasn't shutting down institutions because of sexual misconduct. They were shutting them down because the misconduct became too visible, too public, too hard to explain away. This tells us something crucial about how the medieval church operated. They weren't actually trying to eliminate sexual misconduct. They were trying to eliminate knowledge of sexual misconduct. And there's a massive difference between those two approaches. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation in ways that are absolutely chilling. In 2012, archaeologists excavating a church site in Oxford discovered something that stopped them in their tracks. They found skeletons of nuns who had been buried face down, which was called a prone burial. This wasn't a normal burial practice. This was a mark of shame reserved for witches, sinners, and outcasts. But it gets worse. One of these women had an infant buried between her legs. The archaeologist who discovered this, Paul Murray, noted that this was likely a penitential act to atone for sins. But think about what this really means. Even in death, these women were being marked as different, as shameful, as examples of what happened when you broke the rules. The church was literally using corpses as propaganda. And yet, the same church that was burying nuns face down as punishment was also developing systems to protect other nuns who had committed identical sins. The difference wasn't the severity of the misconduct. The difference was whether the misconduct had become publicly known. This selective enforcement created a climate of fear and uncertainty within convent communities. Nuns never knew whether their activities would be quietly managed or severely punished. It all depended on political factors that had nothing to do with the actual behavior. The case of Catesby Priory that I mentioned earlier provides a perfect example of how this uncertainty played out in real time. When Bishop Alnwick investigated the convent in 1442, he found a community that had essentially split into warring factions. Different groups of nuns were making accusations against each other, trying to deflect attention from their own activities by exposing others. The prioress, Margaret Waver, was accused of having relationships with local knights. Sister Isabel Benet was accused of the same thing, plus spending nights dancing and playing music with friars until midnight. Other nuns were commenting on everyone's impropriety while likely engaging in their own. But what's really fascinating about Bishop Alnwick's report is what it reveals about the social dynamics within the convent. This wasn't just about individual nuns breaking their vows. This was about entire communities developing alternative social structures that operated parallel to the official religious rules. Nuns were forming romantic relationships not just with men from outside the convent, but with each other. They were creating informal hierarchies based on personal loyalty rather than religious authority. They were developing their own systems of justice and punishment that sometimes contradicted official church doctrine. In essence, they were creating their own micro-societies within the larger framework of the convent system. And the church authorities knew about this, but couldn't figure out how to control it without destroying the entire institutional structure. This is where the story gets really complex, because what we're seeing isn't just corruption or moral failure. We're seeing human beings adapting to an impossible situation and creating survival strategies that allowed them to maintain some semblance of normal human relationships within a system designed to prevent exactly that. Many of these women had been forced into convents against their will. They had never chosen the religious life. They had natural human desires for companionship, intimacy, and autonomy. And when the official system denied them these things, they found ways to create them anyway. The church's response to this wasn't to address the underlying problems that were creating the situation. Instead, they doubled down on the concealment strategy. They refined their techniques for managing scandals quietly. They developed more sophisticated methods for identifying and controlling information flow. And they created an entire class of church officials whose primary job was scandal management. These officials developed expertise in what we would now recognize as crisis communications. They knew how to frame stories to minimize damage. They knew how to discredit accusers. They knew how to use theological arguments to justify inaction. They knew how to make problems disappear without actually solving them. The bishop's registers from this period read like instruction manuals for institutional cover-ups. The language is carefully calibrated to acknowledge problems without taking responsibility for them. The documentation is detailed enough to show that authorities were aware of issues, but vague enough to provide plausible deniability if anyone asked uncomfortable questions. But perhaps most importantly, these officials learned how to use the doctrine of scandal as a weapon against anyone who threatened to expose the truth. If someone tried to bring sexual misconduct to public attention, they could be accused of committing the sin of scandal themselves. This created a perfect system of mutual assured destruction that kept almost everyone silent. The few people who did try to speak out faced not just professional consequences, but spiritual ones. They were told that their effort to expose the truth were actually putting their own souls in jeopardy. They were made to feel guilty for caring about justice. This psychological manipulation was incredibly effective. It convinced many potential whistleblowers that staying silent was not just politically wise, but morally necessary. It transformed cowardice into virtue and made collaboration feel like righteousness. And the really disturbing thing is how well this system worked. For centuries, the vast majority of sexual misconduct in medieval convents remained hidden from public view. The church successfully maintained the fiction that their religious institutions were models of moral purity, even while their own internal documents told a completely different story. The statistical analysis I mentioned earlier shows just how pervasive this concealment was. Historians estimate that the surviving documentation represents only a tiny fraction of the actual misconduct that occurred. For every case that was recorded, there were probably dozens that were handled so quietly that no permanent record was created. And remember, the cases that were recorded were typically the ones that couldn't be handled through normal channels. They were the situations that had gotten so complicated or so public that formal documentation became necessary. The routine, everyday misconduct that was managed through informal channels left no trace in the historical record. This means that what we know about sexual activity in medieval convents is just the tip of an enormous iceberg. The full scope of what was happening will never be known because the people who could have documented it had every incentive to destroy the evidence. But even with this limited information, the picture that emerges is absolutely staggering. We're talking about institutional dysfunction on a massive scale, affecting thousands of women across multiple countries over several centuries. And the church's response throughout this entire period was focused not on fixing the problems, but on preventing people from finding out about them. This brings us to one of the most important questions in this entire story. Why did the medieval church choose concealment over reform? Why did they invest so much energy in hiding problems instead of solving them. The answer reveals something fundamental about how institutional power works, and it explains patterns of behavior that we can still see in religious organizations today. The church's primary concern wasn't the spiritual welfare of the nuns or the integrity of religious life. Their primary concern was maintaining institutional authority and social control. Sexual misconduct threatened that authority only if it became publicly known. As long as it remained hidden, it was just an administrative problem that could be managed quietly. Reform, on the other hand, would have required admitting that the system itself was flawed. It would have meant acknowledging that forcing unwilling women into religious life created predictable problems. It would have meant changing fundamental structures that gave the church enormous economic and political benefits. The medieval church made a calculated decision that concealment was more profitable than reform, and they developed the tools and techniques to make that strategy work for centuries. But as we'll see, this strategy came with hidden costs that would eventually threaten the very foundation of church authority. The skills they developed from managing medieval sex scandals would be put to use in much darker contexts. The theological justifications they created for silence would enable much more serious crimes. And the culture of secrecy and mutual protection they established would become so deeply ingrained in church institutions that it would persist long after the medieval period ended. The story of medieval nuns and their secret lives isn't just a historical curiosity. It's the origin story of institutional cover-up culture. It's where some of the most powerful organizations in human history learned how to protect themselves by sacrificing the people they claimed to serve. And once you understand how this system worked in medieval convents, you start to see its fingerprints everywhere in church history. The same patterns, the same justifications, the same techniques used again and again whenever scandal threatened institutional authority. The medieval church didn't just hide sexual misconduct. They pioneered the art of institutional gaslighting. They turned victims into villains, transformed exposure into sin, and made silence seem like a sacred duty. And they did it so effectively that most people still don't know this history exists. But the story gets even darker when you realize that the church wasn't just passively allowing these situations to continue. They were actively profiting from them. And I mean that literally. See, medieval convents weren't just religious institutions, they were economic powerhouses. Noble families would pay enormous dowries to place their daughters in prestigious convents, sometimes equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. These payments went directly to the church, creating a massive revenue stream that depended entirely on maintaining the fiction that convent life was pure and holy. If the truth about what was really happening behind convent walls had become widely known, that entire economic system would have collapsed overnight. Families wouldn't pay premium prices to send their daughters to what they knew were essentially medieval party houses. The church would have lost one of their most reliable sources of income, so they had a direct financial incentive to keep these scandals quiet, regardless of the human cost. And the human cost was staggering. Let me tell you about what happened to nuns who got caught but couldn't be handled through the normal, quiet channels. Because while some women, like the nun in Bergamo, who had 3 children with a priest, eventually became abbesses, others faced consequences so severe they would be considered torture by today's standards. Take the case I mentioned earlier of the nun of Wotton. But I didn't tell you the full story of what happened to her after the other nuns forced her to castrate her lover. After months of being chained in a cell with nothing but bread and water, something extraordinary happened. According to the account by St. Elred, she had a vision where an angel appeared to her and miraculously removed her pregnancy, leaving her body as if she had never been with child. Now, you might think this sounds like medieval superstition, but historians who have studied this case believe something very different happened. They think the nun either had a miscarriage due to the horrific conditions of her imprisonment, or that she gave birth and the baby was immediately taken away and killed to eliminate the evidence. The miracle story was likely a cover-up designed to explain away an inconvenient pregnancy while maintaining the fiction that divine intervention had solved the problem. It allowed the church to present the case as an example of God's mercy rather than human cruelty. And this pattern repeats throughout the historical record. Whenever situations got too extreme to handle through normal channels, the church would find ways to reframe them as miraculous interventions or divine punishments that actually proved the righteousness of their system. But here's what really should terrify you about this story. The techniques they developed for managing these medieval scandals became the template for how the Catholic the next 1,000 years. The same church would handle abuse cases for theological arguments about scandal that they used to justify silence in medieval convents were still being used in the 20th century to protect pedophile priests. The same administrative procedures for quietly transferring problematic individuals were still being implemented in modern dioceses. The same psychological manipulation techniques for convincing victims that speaking out would harm others were still being deployed against contemporary survivors of abuse. When you read the documents from recent Catholic Church abuse scandals, you can see medieval fingerprints all over them. The language, the logic, the organizational structure, even the specific legal arguments, all trace back to systems that were perfected in medieval convents. The church didn't develop these cover-up techniques recently in response to modern scandals. They've been refining them for over 1,000 years, and this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire story. The medieval church's success in hiding the truth about convent life wasn't just about protecting their reputation or their finances. It was about something much more fundamental. They were rewriting reality itself. Think about this for a moment. For centuries, the official story about medieval nuns was that they were models of purity and devotion, who had voluntarily chosen lives of chastity and service to God. This story was told in art, literature, theology, and popular culture. It became so embedded in Western civilization that it shaped how people thought about women, sexuality, religion, and moral authority. But we now know that this story was largely fiction. The reality was that many medieval nuns were unwilling prisoners who found ways to maintain normal human relationships despite being forced into an impossible situation. They weren't saints or sinners. They were just human beings trying to survive in a system designed to deny their humanity. The church's success in hiding this reality means that for over 500 years, Western culture has been operating with a fundamentally false understanding of a major historical institution. Laws were written, social norms were established, and moral frameworks were constructed based on propaganda rather than truth. And the really disturbing thing is how this false narrative was used to justify continuing oppression. If medieval nuns were really models of voluntary purity, then the convent system must have been working perfectly. If women could successfully suppress their natural desires through religious devotion, then there was no need to give them other options for education, independence, or self-determination. The myth of the pure medieval nun became a weapon against women's rights that was used for centuries after the medieval period ended. But let's get back to the specific evidence, because what I'm about to show you reveals just how systematic and organized the church's deception really was. Remember the statistical analysis I mentioned earlier about nearly half of medieval monasteries experiencing sexual misconduct? Well, those statistics come from studying bishops' registers, which were the official record books that church authorities were required to maintain. But when researchers started comparing different bishops' registers from the same time periods and regions, they discovered something absolutely shocking. The same incidents were being recorded completely differently depending on who was writing the report and who was intended to read it. Reports written for internal church consumption contained detailed accounts of sexual misconduct, financial corruption, and administrative chaos. But reports written for higher authorities or external audiences described the exact same situations using vague language that made minor administrative adjustments sound like successful reforms. In other words, the church was maintaining two completely separate sets of records, one that documented what was really happening and another that created the fiction they wanted people to believe. This wasn't accidental or occasional. This was systematic, institutional dishonesty that extended across multiple countries and centuries. The church had developed a sophisticated information management system that allowed them to acknowledge problems internally while denying them externally. And they trained an entire class of church officials to become expert in this kind of selective documentation. These men knew exactly how to phrase things to convey different messages to different audiences. They could make the same set of facts sound either scandalous or routine, depending on the context. The bishops who were conducting these investigations weren't just religious leaders. They were skilled propagandists who understood how to manipulate information to serve institutional interests. But here's where the story takes another dark turn. Because while the church was getting better and better at hiding sexual misconduct, the actual behavior was getting worse and worse. The reform attempts that were made in the middle of the 13th century completely failed to reduce the rates of sexual activity in convents. If anything, the evidence suggests that misconduct increased during the 14th and 15th centuries, even as the church's ability to conceal it became more sophisticated. This created a vicious cycle where the lack of public accountability made the problems worse, which required even more sophisticated cover-up techniques, which reduced accountability even further. By the late medieval period, some convents had essentially become secular communities where religious rules were barely pretended to exist. The nuns lived like medieval socialites, entertaining lovers, hosting parties, wearing expensive clothes, and raising children within the convent walls. At one convent in Italy, the nuns had essentially converted their chapel into a dance hall, where they would host elaborate parties with music, drinking, and what the church records delicately describe as inappropriate mingling with male guests. The abbess was running what was essentially a medieval nightclub while maintaining the fiction that it was a house of prayer. And the local bishop knew about all of this. He had detailed reports, he had eyewitness accounts, he had physical evidence. But instead of taking action, he negotiated a quiet arrangement where the nuns would tone down their activities in exchange for being left alone. The church had moved beyond simply covering up scandals. They were now actively enabling them as long as they could maintain plausible deniability. This is the point where the medieval church's corruption became so systematic that it started to undermine the basic foundations of religious authority. When your spiritual leaders are openly living double lives, and everyone knows it, but no one is allowed to say it, the entire concept of moral guidance becomes meaningless. And yet, somehow, the system held together for centuries longer. The church's propaganda machine was so effective that most people continued to believe the official story even when the evidence of corruption was right in front of them. This tells us something disturbing about how institutional authority works. People have a psychological need to believe that the systems they depend on are legitimate and trustworthy. They will ignore overwhelming evidence of corruption rather than face the anxiety of admitting that their leaders are fraudulent. The church understood this psychological dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. They knew that as long as they maintained the appearance of moral authority, most people would choose to believe the fiction rather than confront the uncomfortable reality. But this strategy had hidden costs that would eventually threaten everything they had built. Because while they were becoming experts at managing information and controlling narratives, they were losing the ability to actually solve problems or provide genuine spiritual guidance. The skills they developed for concealing medieval sex scandals made them incredibly good at institutional self-preservation. But it also made them incredibly bad at everything else that religious institutions are supposed to do. And as we'll see, this trade-off between institutional survival and institutional purpose would eventually create contradictions so severe that the entire system would begin to collapse under its own weight. The medieval church's success in hiding the truth about convent life wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a master class in institutional manipulation that would shape how powerful organizations operate for centuries to come. They didn't just cover up scandals. They pioneered the techniques that modern corporations, governments, and institutions still use today when they need to protect themselves from inconvenient truths. The medieval Catholic Church invented the playbook for institutional gaslighting. And once you understand how that playbook was created, you start to see it everywhere in modern society. But the story doesn't end with medieval convents, because the same church officials who perfected these techniques in dealing with nuns would soon face much bigger challenges that would test their cover-up abilities in ways they never imagined. The Protestant Reformation was coming, and when Martin Luther nailed his complaints to that church door in 1517, one of his major criticisms was the moral corruption he had witnessed in Catholic institutions. Luther knew about the convent scandals. He knew about the cover-ups. He knew about the financial corruption. And he was about to make it very difficult for the Catholic Church to maintain their carefully constructed fiction about the purity of religious life. The question was whether the techniques they had developed for managing medieval sex scandals would be enough to survive the first major challenge to their authority in over 1,000 years. And the answer to that question would determine not just the fate of the Catholic Church, but the entire future of Christianity in the Western world. Because, you see, what happened in those medieval convents wasn't just about sex. It was about truth, power, and the price of institutional survival. And that price was about to come due. The cover-up techniques the medieval church perfected in those convent walls would face their ultimate test in the decades that followed. Because while they were becoming masters at managing information and controlling narratives, the world around them was changing in ways they couldn't control. The printing press had been invented, literacy rates were climbing, ideas were spreading faster than ever before, and people were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why there seemed to be such a gap between what the church preached and what it actually practiced. When Martin Luther posted his criticisms in 1517, he wasn't just challenging Catholic theology. He was directly attacking the culture of secrecy and corruption that had been festering in religious institutions for centuries. And he had allies who knew exactly what was happening behind those convent walls. Former nuns started speaking out. Priests who had been silenced by the scandal doctrine found their voices. Church officials who had been complicit in cover-ups began having crises of conscience. The carefully constructed wall of silence that had protected institutional secrets for hundreds of years suddenly developed cracks. But here's what's truly remarkable about this moment in history. Even facing the greatest threat to their authority in over a millennium, the Catholic Church's first instinct wasn't to reform their practices. It was to double down on the same cover-up techniques they had been using in medieval convents. So there you have it, the real story behind medieval convents, hidden for centuries by one of history's most sophisticated propaganda machines. From Sant'Angelo's 86 years of documented scandals to Joan of Leeds faking her own death. From the brutal castration at Wotton to the dance halls masquerading as chapels, we've seen how the medieval church didn't just cover up sexual misconduct. They invented the playbook for institutional gaslighting that's still being used today. The doctrine of scandal they created to silence victims became the blueprint for centuries of cover-ups, proving that when institutions choose concealment over reform, The cost isn't just truth, it's humanity itself. And that's a lesson worth remembering.